The most important aspect of any political movement is the goal. What do you want? For the civil rights movement, it was fair treatment no matter one's race. For the women's liberation movement, it was equal rights and opportunities as well as greater personal freedom for women. For the gay rights movement, it was equal treatment and protections against violence and discrimination. But what exactly does the trans rights movement want? On a surface level, it might seem like the trans rights movement wants the same things that the gay rights movement wanted. Acceptance, to have access to housing, jobs, health services, education, and public goods and services without discrimination or mistreatment. And yet, when you look beneath the surface, you'll find that the TRA movement is actually moving towards different goals, no matter what they may publicly state. Not that there seems to be an agreed-upon goal either. Every banner that flies seems to center around various goals now that acceptance is all but agreed upon, especially in the West. But some of the goals that I have heard have been to listen to and uplift trans voices, to gain access to single-sex spaces, including sports leagues and colleges, to allow changes to identification documents to conform with a person's current gender identity without the need for sex reassignment surgery or any medical requirements, which is known as gender self-identification, to allow minors to make bodily changes to further receive gender-affirming care, and to be accepted in the cis dating scene. Overall, one can see that none of these goals really falls into line with the problems that actually plague the trans community, and the goals that often make headlines are concerning at best and utterly devastating to others at worst. Let's start by going into what each of these goals really means. Number 1, to listen to and uplift trans voices. I believe that this goal is well-meaning. For the last few years, it's become more common to listen to minority voices and to offer a platform to allow the oppressed to speak about their experiences so that those of the out-group can adjust their behavior accordingly and offer support. However, if you actually listen to trans voices, you'll find that it doesn't mirror the demands or experiences of similar minority groups at all. If you listen to trans voices, you'll find men who equate womanhood to stereotypes and sexualization instead of the gender nonconformity caused anguish that one would expect. These leaders do not use their voices to speak about true problems like access to healthcare, jobs, fetishization, or a need for better treatments to dysphoria. Instead, you'll find a wide variety of behavior that makes you wonder if these people think women are human after all. In the words of various trans community leaders, there is something about being treated like shit by men that feels like affirmation itself, like a cry of delight from the deepest cavern of my breast. To be the victim of honest, undisguised sexism possesses an exhilarating vitality. Grace Lavery. Women around the world have been treated as sexual objects. Yet if sexual objectification is so categorically awful, then why do I want it so badly? The idea that being seen as a sex object is universally a bad thing is too simple, like many tenets of feminism. Jacob Tobia. The narrative is that the transgender people will come into bathrooms and abuse little girls. The supposed purity of the victims has remained stagnant. There are no princesses. Little girls are also kinky. Your kids aren't as straight and narrow as you think. Alok Fade Menon. You'll find plenty of proof of trans women who switch from being neo-Nazis and incels to trans women as well. When I was an egg, the envy got so bad that I started hating women just on principle. Like, why should they be pretty and cute and I'm stuck in hell? It caused me to troll women online and act like an MGTOW/incel/nice guy/piece of shit. If I hadn't have come out and transitioned, I would have likely become the exact epitome of the kind of person that I hate the most right now. I was a straight, white, neckbeardy, why aren't there straight/white pride parades misogynist douchebag. If I hadn't have come out, I'd likely have been the type of guy to bitch about being an incel and shudders. I am a literal ex-Nazi trans female, so I can relate. Solidarity, comrade. Trust me, I used to be a Nazi even as I was discovering I was trans. I've seen a lot of people go from fascist MRA to trans girl in their journeys. I wasn't a brony. Back then, I was closer to just your run-of-the-mill incel. Former incel. Current happy trans girl. A huge amount of the reason I was an incel was because I was a closeted trans girl. Me in high school also was pretty much a Nazi, hated the world, etc. Now I am a very cheerful and loving trans girl, woo. Seems like anyone who went to 4chan either grows up to be trans or a white supremacist, and there's zero middle ground. I'm really obsessed with incels. So many of them are actually repressed trans women, it's impressive. Oh, hey, same. I used to run in neckbeard 4chan incel circles. Now my name is Rebecca and I'm a girl. When did that happen? I was more an incelish transphobe than anything. Looking back at my past kinda disgusts me, but now I'm good with myself. Honestly makes me wonder how many incels are in trans denial. Honestly, I think that most incels are transgenders in denial. I never come across a group of men who are so jealous and envious of women. All they ever do is talk about how women are lucky and fortunate. Also, most have body dysphoria and hate how they look. If that isn't an egg about to crack, then I don't know what is. Transmaxing to get lesbians is my idea, and I hope it spreads. I was a borderline ultra manipulative incel before I first realized I'm trans. I physically harmed people just like us before I cracked. And, most simply, I was a raging misogynist for years. In addition, there is an active hostility and ostracism towards those who detransition, making it difficult for anyone to share experiences of transitioning that don't follow the popular belief that it solves everything. This leads to massive miscommunication and lack of informed consent regarding transitioning. I suspect this is because the first wave of detransitioners foretells the fate of the trans movement at large. After spending thousands of dollars undergoing numerous medical procedures, these people find that living as the opposite sex isn't possible and doesn't cure their problems at heart. And of course, this brings up the questions. Either these people were not trans and the current medical field is unequipped to tell the difference between people who are trans and those who are not, or they are trans and transitioning still did not work to cure their dysphoria or treat any of the problems that transitioning was meant to fix. I'd recommend listening to first-hand accounts of detransitioners' experiences to truly understand what it's like to be trans and fall out of the movement, but for now, I'd like to highlight just one example. Kat Kattinson doesn't believe in transgender ideology even though she identified as a trans man for more than 15 years. I'm a detransitioner, she told the Epoch Times in an interview. I identified as trans when I was a child, but now accept my biological sex. I believe that a woman is an adult human female. I don't believe that trans women literally are women. I don't believe that trans men literally are men. I still believe they're biological males and females. She has many regrets about transitioning, but none as great as trying to take her own life twice as a teen or injecting herself once a week with 40 to 60 milligrams of testosterone. Kattinson, now 30, has just 2 minutes to tell her story at a California Senate Health Committee hearing in Sacramento on April 6th. She is opposed to Senate Bill 923, which would require healthcare providers to compel staff and contractors to complete training on gender-affirming care. She has been shunned by trans activists and ignored by politicians, the media, and the medical community. Overall, it seems as if the trans community doesn't actually want you to listen to trans voices, because if you do, you'll realize that all is not as it may first seem. Listening to trans voices may actually reveal that there are more problems in the community than they want to admit. Number 2, to gain access to single-sex spaces, including sports leagues and colleges. To be honest, this goal is one that has already been achieved. There is a long list of trans athletes who not only have competed but have won competitions and been awarded for their actions. Single-sex spaces like bathrooms and women's shelters have been forced to concede to include trans people, and if they refuse, often end up risking lawsuits or losing funding. Tertiary options like separate facilities or leagues have been turned down as transphobic and ostracizing. Many claim that participation in sports is a natural human right and that those who identify as transgender must have the absolute right to compete in sports, and without any checks and balances such as limits on testosterone. Rachel McKinnon argued that this is bigger than sports and it's about human rights. By catering to cisgender people views, that furthers transgender people's oppression. Of course, this ignores that biologically male people, regardless of internal sense of gender, have always had the right to single-sex spaces. As quoted from Helen Joyce's Trans, the best schools and all universities, well-paid jobs, sporting competitions, political institutions, all were male only. Some of women's anger at the recent pretense that it's impossible to distinguish between males and females stems from knowing that, when it was women who were excluded, there was no uncertainty. When you are of the sex identifying into the other's privileges, you may not feel accommodating when self-identification in the other direction is cast as a human right. It also ignores concerns about safety. World Rugby says significant safety concerns have emerged following recent research into the participation of trans-identified males in women's rugby, and it may be necessary to make the sport female only. A draft document by its transgender working group says it is likely to be a 20-30% greater risk of injury when a female player is tackled by someone who has gone through male puberty. The document also says the latest science shows that some trans-identified males retain significant physical advantages over biological women even after they take medication to lower their testosterone. Although the World Rugby Organization has stuck to their guns and has barred trans women from playing, other sports teams lag behind, putting the women who play them at risk. Some examples of this gender colonization are as follows. In 2013, a U.S. Navy veteran previously known as Boyd Burton was the first man to compete against a woman. He fought twice before it came to light that he was born male and then competed 4 more times after. Fallon Fox brutally beat opponent Tamika Brent within the first 2 minutes of one match. Brent was hospitalized with a concussion and an orbital bone fracture that had to be closed with 7 staples to her head. In 2018, Rachel McKinnon, a 36-year-old Canadian man, became the first man to win gold in the women's 35 to 44 age bracket at the UCI Masters Track Championships. Until 2018, Hannah Mounsey, at 6'3" and 250 pounds, was allowed to play in the women's division of the Australian Football League. In 2019, Cece Selfer easily won the 400-meter hurdles at the NCAA Division II Outdoor Track and Field Championships, winning the final race by more than a second. Tefler also finished 5th in the 100-meter hurdles, earning All-America honors. In 2019, Tyler Porter, a trans-identified male, has publicly boasted on social media of harassing women at the downtown Eastside Women's Center in Vancouver. The center's mission is to provide a safe, non-judgmental environment for women from all walks of life who live and or work in the downtown Eastside. To achieve this goal, the center provides supportive surroundings with meals, counseling, advocacy, and programs which nurture and empower members, according to their website. They also provide overnight rage and shelter. In 2019, after a year of membership at the Xochimilco branch of SmartFit, Paulina Malagon, who had been consuming cross-sex hormones for 3 months, informed staff that he was now a woman and require access to the women's changing area and showers. Staff at the branch refused Mr. Malagon's request to use the women's locker room, directing him instead to the locker room and shower designated for clients with disabilities. I do not agree that your solution is that I use the locker room for the disabled or for fear of any possible complaint from any user who was offended or scandalized by my use of the women's locker room. He replied by letter, greatly offended. Mr. Malagon claims that on several occasions he had been the subject of lascivious looks, prolonged laughter, and commentary in the men's locker room after beginning the transition into gender identity. In January 2020, a male teacher penned an open letter in Our Lives, an LGBT Madison newsletter, accusing the Madison Metropolitan School District of transphobia because the district encouraged adult staff to use staff washrooms, not those designated for children. Vika Steele, previously named Mark Bussenbark, currently identifies as a woman and wants to continue using the girls' washroom directly across from the science teacher's second-floor classroom, rather than an all-gender bathroom further away on the first floor, despite parental concerns about him sharing a space with kindergartners. In 2021, Alana McLaughlin, who was born male and is now a mixed martial arts fighter, made his debut by choking out a woman during a match. Also in 2021, the University of Otago and Otago University Students Association awarded a male weightlifter, Laurel Hubbard, Sportswoman of the Year at its Blue and Golds Awards 2021. These awards celebrate achievements to the highest degree in sports, culture, community, and the arts. On August 2, 2021, The Telegraph reported that it had perfected policies from over 20 National Health Services trusts and found they have issued guidance specifying that patients can choose the ward, toilets, and shower facilities that align with their gender identity. Those who complain have been labeled transphobic. One hospital group previously withdrew treatment from female patients who did not accept male individuals being placed on women-only wards. A mental health trust has suggested that women who object should be placed in seclusion and long-term segregation. Guidance also states that male sex offenders are to be placed on women-only wards if they choose, and that risk should be managed. All in all, this goal has been accomplished. Despite being a minority, trans people are constantly accommodated by the world at large, even when it hurts a greater part of the population, especially when it hurts women. Number 3. To allow changes to identification documents to conform with a person's current gender identity without the need for sex reassignment surgery or any medical requirements, which is known as gender self-identification. Gender self-identification is the concept that a person's legal sex or gender should be determined by their gender identity without any medical requirements. In other words, if you say you are a woman, you are one. Those who support self-ID laws argue that the current medical requirements, which vary from country to country, can force trans people into undergoing surgery, and they are intrusive and humiliating forms of gatekeeping, and that self-identification will make it easier for transgender people to live day to day without prejudice. This ties in with the now nebulous definition of being transgender. If you feel trans, you are trans, they say, making it difficult to determine what exactly being transgender is supposed to mean. The lack of clarity seems to stem from its basis in sexism. No more are boys and girls encouraged to do whatever they like, no matter what stereotypes propose, but woman and man are now defined by the same stereotypes that feminists of the 80s and 90s tried so hard to break free of. Concerns especially arise around children. So many young adults and teenagers will get surgeries and procedures that they are not fully able to consent to, nor are informed about, resulting in regret and endless medical bills down the line. In Germany, one of the bills proposed that children be allowed to have gender reassignment surgery from the age of 14, even if parents oppose it. It would also have introduced a fine of $3,445 in American money for referring to a trans person based on their natal sex. The feeling of righteousness from being a wrongly oppressed group provides the confidence that many have that a misguided understanding of the intersection of biology and cultural factors can be changed just by declaring it so. This same reasoning is why so many people detransition. A discomfort with their bodies should not be treated by telling them that it means that their bodies are wrong. Any deviation from the gendered norm is considered to be a sign of being trans or an egg waiting to crack. Even behaviors that would otherwise be recognized as perverted or unhealthy have been bent to fit this vague definition. And yet, despite it all, most attempts to legalize gender self-identification have succeeded. A report by an international trans activist group explains the tactics being used to win legal self-identification of gender with minimal public or legislative scrutiny. The report explains how major changes to legal definitions of sex and gender have made rapid progress in just a few years by advising campaigners to avoid press exposure, influence political parties by infiltrating their youth organizations, hide gender self-ID among the more popular reforms such as gay marriage, and to be wary of compromise. It also suggests government agendas can be shaped by drafting legislative proposals before civil servants do, and by acting quickly to take advantage of windows of opportunity such as any events that create a backlash against anti-LGBTI sentiment. As well as shielding proposals from public scrutiny, the report advises hiding self-identification among other reforms. In Ireland, Denmark, and Norway, changes to the law on legal gender recognition were put through at the same time as other more popular reforms such as marriage equality legislation. This provided a veil of protection, particularly in Ireland, where marriage equality was strongly supported, but gender identity remained a more difficult issue to win public support for. If these laws continue to pass, women may lose the war to uphold boundaries they fought so hard to achieve. For example, the Equality Act of 2010 recognizes that women as a sex are a disadvantaged, vulnerable group and upholds their right to single-sex spaces and services. Domestic violence shelters, for example, must remain single-sex spaces because the presence of men, however they identify, could set back or even prevent recovery. Not to mention, the unquestioned authority of trans people as being the most oppressed of all has created many loopholes that predators will not wait to take advantage of. Power corrupts does not mean oppression purifies. Predatory men often go to great lengths to gain access to vulnerable women, and will likely abuse the notion of gender self-identity and take advantage of the new belief that anyone can be trans without undergoing any physical changes like hormones or surgery. What is really interesting is that while transitioning sexes is considered possible and not at all questionable, the trans community is unwilling to accept those who attempt to be transracial. It seems as if most understand how being racially colorblind fails to address racism because it fails to distinguish the oppressing versus oppressed classes, but they are unable to apply the same thinking to transitioning. Pretending biosex is undetectable or unimportant does the same thing. If one can accept that race is immutable and biological and changes the way you are treated in the world even though there is no actual scientific basis for any racist superiority, then why can't they acknowledge that being female is distinct from being male and changes the way that you are treated in the world even though there is no actual scientific basis for a superior sex? How is it offensive for a white person to say, I just feel like a black person, like I'm sexy and love fried chicken and soul music, and pretend that means they've never had white privilege, but a male saying, I just feel like a woman. I'm always nesting and clumsy and hypersexualized is the most oppressed woman of all. This disparity is in the concurrent discussions of Black Lives Matter versus sex-based oppression stems from liberals not believing that women are actually an oppressed class. These issues are different, true, but this comparison fits for any axis of oppression where acknowledging a difference between the privileged and the disenfranchised is not the same as granting the natural supremacy of the privileged. Gender self-identification goes far beyond respecting people's right to believe what they want, to dress or act or express their identity as they want. Numerous transgender rights groups, supporters, and prominent trans individuals seek to claim all the rights of the sex with which they feel their gender identity corresponds. This is a political and social demand that affects everybody, but in particular women, gay people, and transsexuals. I would draw an analogy with religious identities. In liberal democracies, people can believe in God in a holy text, dress and worship as they wish, and be protected by law from discrimination. But they cannot insist that the rest of us adhere to those beliefs or turn their holy texts into laws that we must obey. Gender self-identification affects women's single-sex spaces and political autonomy, especially as regards the right of women as a sex to organize independently their own opposition to sexism and misogyny. Perhaps most profoundly, it affects the right of women to define themselves. Many women do not want to be defined once again by the very gender norms that have disenfranchised them from birth. Passivity, selfless accommodation to others, especially men, meekness, reserve, being measured by looks rather than deeds, and so on. These are norms that constrain and demean women. Many of us insist that, fundamentally, women are members of a sex of shared biology and socialization. Biological sex is real and is the very foundation of our species. Number 4, to allow minors to make bodily changes to further receive gender-affirming care. My previous point already touched on the problem of many young people accessing permanent procedures in the name of gender-affirming care. Many say that minors should be able to take puberty blockers to stop a person from having the wrong puberty. Often, this is followed by a promise that stopping puberty is harmless and can be reversed at any time. This is not true. It is notoriously difficult to find information about the effects of puberty blockers on children, but since Lupron was first prescribed in 1985 for a variety of conditions, including prostate cancer, endometriosis, IVF, and precocious puberty, there's been a large number of complaints and lawsuits. Lynn Massillin is the founder of LupronVictimsHub.com, where one can find plenty of first-hand accounts of the effects. Here are some. Kinney says, does anyone know of any physicians that have backed up the theory that Lupron will destroy lives and leave a person permanently disabled? My wife was administered the drug multiple times, 2 IVF cycles and 1 to control endo. To make a long story short, she has since been diagnosed with over a dozen serious diseases and illnesses. Some of her symptoms are still undiagnosed. She was a healthy professional just 3 years ago, and is now immobile, disabled, and in severe pain every day. Her primary doctor is convinced the Lupron is the culprit, but he wants to speak with other physicians that is familiar with the long-lasting side effects of Lupron. So hopefully there is another doctor out there that might help her. I am just heartbroken to watch my 35-year-old wife and high school sweetheart deteriorate more and more each day without any of this making sense. Michelle says, I can't say what caused my problems, but back in August of 2014, I began Lupron injections to December of 2014. By the 22nd of January 2015, I was informed that I needed a hysterectomy. The hot flashes and insomnia, awful. I was always a very upbeat and on-the-go worker and mom. My life has been deteriorating since. My bowels no longer work properly, suffer from anxiety and depression. They can't find anything but IBS. I have severe pain for days on end after a BM, and going feels like I'm being torn apart inside. I take a slew of medication that seemed to help a bit for a couple months, but now constant abdominal pain. I've changed my diet and lost my job due to how many bad days I have. I go to U of M for special doctors. I've had 2 laparoscopy surgeries and 3 colonoscopies within this last year. I want my life back. I want my son to have his mom back. I cry because I can't run around with him. I don't know if these injections are the cause of this awful downward spiral. I can say never in my life have I had any of these problems. I'm 36 and should be full of life. I pray for answers. Tara says, I've had 5 pelvic procedures for endo and wound up having a radical hysterectomy, oophorectomy, and appendectomy at age 33. When I started having severe, unmanageable pelvic pain during periods, my OBGYN suspected endo and started Lupron in 2012. I've done several courses of the drug and had multiple surgeries, just so I can play with my 3-year-old son. Nothing ever worked, and now I'm worse than ever. I sleep up to 18 hours a day, but sometimes only sleep 2 hours. I'm in pain constantly. I have brain fog, dizziness, IBFs, vitamin D deficiency, joint pain, chest pain, high cholesterol, and depression. I've seen dozens of doctors and specialists, tried nearly every treatment: drugs, physical therapy, CPAP, chiropractic care, acupuncture. I've had tests for Lyme, mono, narcolepsy, thyroid disease, colonoscopies, endoscopies, scans on my thyroid. The list goes on and on. My disability got denied as they couldn't find the diagnosis, and I'm not sure how much longer I can fight to keep working. I take 7 medications a day minimum, and they only keep me semi-functional 4 to 5 days a week. I don't know what else to do. All the doctors seem clueless as to how to improve my quality of life. And these are just a few. If one does go ahead with other gender-affirming surgeries, there are still plenty of side effects that a child simply isn't able to understand properly or consent to. Buck Angel, possibly one of the oldest FTM transsexuals, almost died from complications due to long-term testosterone use. Here's an excerpt from her Instagram post after surgery. No one ever told me about atrophy. Ever. I suffered for years of debilitating cramps, mostly after sex. The gynecologist, well, the ones that would see me, and many would not, would say, "Oh, that's normal pain." What the hell is normal pain? They said that because they had no clue. They just kept giving me testosterone, and the pain just keeps coming. One day I passed out. Fever, emergency room, infection, sepsis. They said, "Wow, if you waited 5 more minutes, you might be dead." They had no clue. After years of testosterone on my reproductive system, it is atrophied. Beyond belief, the doctor said. He had never seen anything like this. My cervix fused to my uterus. An infection formed. This was the cramping. The infection burst. This is the sepsis. Additionally, trans men are typically recommended for a hysterectomy a few years into their transition. In one cross-sectional study, 20% of respondents had a hysterectomy to decrease post-testosterone cramping, and another 22% to stop extreme bleeding and cramping. 42% of trans men had hysterectomies to prevent excruciating pain. Doing so doesn't save them from danger or health risk, as a hysterectomy puts you in danger of pelvic organ prolapse and pelvic floor dysfunction, bowel dysfunction, incontinence, fistulas, sexual dysfunction, and it can be linked to higher risk of dementia. I'd like to point out that studies have shown that if left untreated, gender dysphoria persists by adulthood, and many people who have transitioned as a child or teenager end up detransitioning in adulthood. And more importantly, the pressure to transition is not altruistic. In 2019, the market size for sex reassignment surgery alone was $316 million. It was projected that by 2026, the market would be $1.5 billion. More customers are needed to continue growing this market, and once you're in, you're in. These procedures can easily cost tens of thousands of dollars a pop, and even just hormones cost about $100 a month without insurance. There are not a lot of studies on long-term effects of transitioning. This is not only because it is a relatively new development, but because in order to create trans people, the industry needs to suppress counter evidence for these money-making procedures. It's happened before, with cigarettes, sugar, and gasoline. You'd have to be a fool to deny that another billion-dollar industry would not do the same. And number 5, to be accepted in the cis dating scene. To be honest, I think that the debate surrounding trans acceptance and sexuality focuses far too much on who doesn't want to date trans women, then it subsequently ignores the actual sexual exploitation that routinely takes place behind closed doors. Because here's the thing. There is no shortage of men that include trans women in their sexuality by consuming copious amounts of trans pornography and setting up discreet hookups that will never go public. Trans people as a demographic experience high rates of sexualization and fetishization, and it is overwhelmingly coming from men who also pose the most danger. After all, it's not women who are going around murdering trans women in the streets, and this is far more problematic than someone not being sexually attractive to trans people. But since so many trans people believe that not being sexually accepted is the greater problem, let's talk about that. There is a myriad of screenshots of people saying the most vile and homophobic things because homosexuals do not want to date trans people. Homosexuality is an attraction to the same sex. It's why for years we've ignored jeers about the gender nonconformists in our midst who they claim have penis or womanly for not looking enough like a man or a woman. It doesn't matter what clothes you wear or what pronouns you use. You are the sex you were born as. It does not restrict who you are, though society may give you a gender role nonetheless. A butch woman is still a woman. A twank is still a man. And the fact that sexuality isn't mutable, like they claim sex to be, means that denying a trans person on a basis of sex tears down their argument from the base up and offers an acceptable target for homophobia to become public again. I've talked about it before, and I will likely talk about it again, but I went into detail about it on my video on the cotton ceiling, so if you're interested in the deeper dive, I recommend checking that one out. Quite simply, it does not matter if trans people do not feel included in everything. Sometimes certain spaces need to practice exclusion, and that is not inherently oppression. If you go to an amusement park and are not allowed to go on a kid's ride, that's not oppression because that space was not made for you. It was not made to accommodate and serve you, and if provisions were made to do so, it will be to the detriment of those that the ride was meant to serve. It doesn't matter if this makes you feel invalidated, and if it does, it might be worth considering how strong your identity is that it crumbles under the scrutiny and refusal of others. Everyone has a right to be included in voting, representation in local and federal legislature. Everyone needs access to public goods and services, education, health services. But the things that you are on your own to find or make, such as friends, social groups, sexual partners, special interest groups, are not required to associate with you no matter how much you'd like them to. So, now that we know what the trans movement is working towards, now what? They seem to be winning on most of these goals. I think it's important to see the overarching theme here. Each and every goal they want to attain involves tearing down the boundaries of others and preventing anyone else from scrutinizing their movement or voicing concerns. This isn't a topic that we can stand idly by and relegate to online discussions. Education is the first step, but we have to bring this into the real world. Ask people in our lives if they support this, and if not, then we must collectively take steps to stop it from going any further, unquestioned as it is. Because comparing these demands to that of the civil rights movement, of the women's liberation movement, of the gay rights movement, they're not asking for access to housing, for jobs, to not be discriminated against. They're asking for us to make way for them no matter who that hurts, no matter what harm they may cause. And I just don't think that's right. This, dear viewers, is where we part. It is 1:16 a.m. I have an exam tomorrow I have not studied enough for. My voice is going out because I have been talking for 30 minutes. This is my longest video to date. And probably the longest I'll have for a while too, because my voice. If you have any concerns, questions, comments, please leave them. I want to know what you think. This video was very comprehensive, but also didn't go into depth with each of these topics, as in this is every aspect of just gender ideology. You could just write books and books about just the smallest aspects. So even though this was 30 minutes, even though I wrote, 16 pages? I mean, I wrote all this stuff and I'm still not going all the way into it. There's still so much more I can say. I have to edit out so many pauses for me to drink my White Claw. I've gone through our requests. I see what you guys are asking for. I have a list of videos coming out, which include disability and mental illness trend, talking about Douglas/Donna Perry, AGPs, pornography becoming mainstream, social media indoctrinating minors, as well as Dana Rivers, and these are all going to come out when they come out. I gotta admit, you guys love giving some interesting topics, and they definitely take a while to write scripts for. But I will see you guys next time. Bye.